I have been working the night shift for almost 2 years. I leave the diner around 2 in the morning, get in my car, and drive for about 20 minutes to my house, located on a quiet street at the end of a residential neighborhood. It's not a dangerous place, but it's not busy either. I've always liked the tranquility, but lately I've been feeling strangely vulnerable coming home so late. It's an irrational fear, or at least, that's what I thought until that specific night. The night when everything changed. I was exhausted as I turned onto my street. I could hardly wait to take a shower and collapse into bed. That's when, as I pulled into my garage, I noticed something strange. At the edge of my property, where the porch light didn't quite reach, there was a figure standing still. I could only see a dark silhouette, motionless, facing in my direction. My first thought was that it was a neighbor or some drunk passerby. I ignored it. I was too tired to deal with anything. I quickly locked my car, went inside, and shut the door behind me without looking back. I threw my things on the couch, kicked off my shoes, and headed straight for the shower. The hot water helped ease my exhaustion, but an odd feeling lingered. Something about that figure outside wouldn't leave my mind. Even so, I forced myself to ignore it. Maybe it was just someone passing by. Maybe they weren't even looking at me. After my shower, I made some tea and lay in bed with my phone. Fatigue soon overcame me, and I was just about to drift off when I heard a faint noise from outside. A dry, uneven sound, like someone stepping on the gravel in the driveway. My body froze. I held my breath and stayed completely still, trying to listen more carefully. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, another crunch, closer this time. My hands trembled slightly as I grabbed my phone and opened the security camera app. The image loaded and my heart pounded. There he was. The same man. But now he was no longer at the edge of the property. He was at the bottom of my porch steps, facing my door, standing completely still. My breathing grew shallow. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking around. He was just there, standing, staring at my door. The camera didn't show many details of his face, just his rigid silhouette, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he were waiting for something. I clutched my phone to my chest, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. For a moment I thought about shouting through the window, asking what he wanted, but something told me that would be a mistake. Instead, I went straight to my phone and dialed the police. I tried to keep my voice calm, but I could hear the tremor in my words as I explained the situation. The dispatcher said they would send a patrol car, but it might take a while since all units were currently occupied with other calls. Great. Meanwhile, I was alone in my house with a strange man standing on my porch with no explanation. I glanced back at the screen. He was still there, not moving, just waiting. Minutes passed. I couldn't take my eyes off the phone screen, afraid that if I looked away for even a second, he would disappear, or worse, come even closer. My mind began to race with possibilities. Was he just trying to scare me? Or was he waiting for me to make a mistake, to leave a door unlocked, a curtain open? The only thing I knew for sure was that he wanted me to be aware of his presence. That thought made me sick. Then, he moved. It wasn't a step, not a sudden movement, just a slight tilt of his head, as if he were trying to hear something inside the house. My throat went dry. I could barely breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he raised one hand and placed it on the porch railing. My muscles tensed. I knew that if he started climbing the steps, there wouldn't be much I could do. My only escape was through the back door, and I didn't want to run out into the night with him following me. I stood there completely still, feeling my chest rise and fall too fast as I tried to think of what to do. My first impulse was to call someone, anyone, but who would answer the phone at 3 in the morning? The police were already on their way, but what if he tried to get in before they arrived? Moving slowly to avoid making noise, I made my way to the kitchen, where I kept a large knife in the drawer. My hands shook as I gripped it. I didn't know if I would have the courage to use it, but at least I wouldn't feel so defenseless. I checked my phone again, and he was still there, standing in the same spot with his hand on the railing. Then something changed. Slowly, he lifted his other hand and placed it on the door handle. My stomach twisted. He was testing if the door was unlocked. I tightened my grip on the knife, swallowing hard. My knees felt weak, but I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I was about to scream, to bang on the door, to do anything to scare him off, but before I could move, he did something that made my blood run cold. He lowered his head, resting his forehead against the door. as if he were listening to something inside the house. I couldn't understand what he was doing. He just stood there, pressing his forehead against the wood, breathing slowly. I could see from the camera's reflection that his shoulders rose and fell in a rhythmic motion, as if he were concentrating on something. My chest ached from holding my breath, and then, without warning, he began to turn the doorknob. My body reacted before my mind could process it. I ran to the door and slammed the lock shut, making sure it was secure. A second later, I heard the dry click of the lock, followed by the sound of the handle trying to turn unsuccessfully. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The man stood still for a few more seconds. Then, without haste, he let go of the doorknob and took a step back. I could still see him through the camera. He didn't seem frustrated. He didn't seem angry. It was as if he already knew the door would be locked, as if he was merely confirming it. And the worst part? He still hadn't looked directly at the camera. It was as if he knew I was watching, but he didn't care. After what felt like an eternity, he simply turned his head to the side, as if he were listening to something in the distance. My chest rose and fell too fast. I wanted this to be over. I wanted to hear the sound of a siren cutting through the silence of the street, anything to confirm that the police were finally arriving. But there was nothing but the low hum of the wind and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The man remained still for a few more seconds, then, without warning, he simply turned around and started walking slowly off the porch. I wanted to believe he was leaving, but the way he moved, unhurried, without hesitation, gave me the impression that he wasn't afraid of being seen, as if he knew that no one could stop him. He stepped out of the porch camera's view, and for a moment, I thought it was finally over. But then, I noticed something at the edge of the screen, the backyard camera. He hadn't left. He was walking around the house. My stomach twisted. What if he tried the back door? What if there was an unlocked window? My body froze for a moment, but then, a sound shattered the silence of the night. The rumble of an approaching engine. The flashing lights of a patrol car reflected against my windows. He noticed, and that was when he did something I will never forget. He stopped, looked directly at the side camera, and smiled. That smile chilled me to the bone. It wasn't a normal smile. There was nothing friendly or casual about it. It was slow, calculated, as if he were enjoying all of this, as if he knew that even with the police here, I would never forget this night. The moment the patrol car's lights illuminated my yard, he took a step back and, without any rush, disappeared into the darkness of the street. I ran to the front window, trying to see him flee, but he was simply gone, as if he had never been there. When the officers knocked on the door, my hands were still trembling as I unlocked it. I explained everything to them, showed them the camera footage, but the response was the same as always. Unfortunately, without a crime being committed, there's not much we can do. They searched the area but found no sign of him. No footprints, no objects left behind, just an unsettling emptiness that made my skin crawl. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying it could have been just some vagrant, but I knew it wasn't. This man wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He knew exactly what he was doing. After the police left, I tried to convince myself that it was over, but the fear didn't fade. My body was still on high alert. Every sound in the house felt amplified. I locked every window, checked every door at least 3 times before finally forcing myself to go to bed. But sleeping, that was impossible. I lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every tiny noise in the night. Was he still nearby? Would he come back? My heart only began to slow when the first rays of sunlight crept into my room. Daylight brought a false sense of security. When I finally gathered the courage to get out of bed, I walked to the front door. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but when I opened it, a shiver ran down my spine. Right in the center of the welcome mat was a single muddy footprint, and what made my stomach tighten was what I saw on the doorknob, a dark, sticky smudge. I stepped closer, cautiously, and only then did I realize what it was. Dried blood. He had touched my door before leaving, like a farewell, like a promise that somehow this wasn't over. My stomach churned. I instinctively backed away from the door, as if that smudge could contaminate me. The feeling of being watched returned with full force. I looked around, the street, the neighbors' yards, but there was no one. The morning silence seemed to mock me, as if everything that had happened the night before had been a nightmare. But it wasn't. The footage was there, the muddy footprint was there, and that blood, that was real. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and called the police again. I told them about the footprint, about the blood, but the response was the same as before. "We'll send a unit to check it out." They came, looked around, took some photos, but they didn't seem particularly interested in investigating. One of the officers suggested the blood could be from an animal. I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew that had been left there on purpose, as a message, as a way to remind me that last night I hadn't just seen a stranger standing on my porch. He had been testing something. He had been waiting for something. And maybe this still wasn't over. After the police left, I tried to go about my day as normally as possible. I scrubbed the doorknob with disinfectant, washed the porch mat, and checked all the locks once more. But none of it eased the feeling that I was still vulnerable. I spent the entire afternoon glancing at the security cameras every few minutes, half expecting to see him there again. Every shadow, every passing car made me hold my breath. I knew there was no point in being paranoid, but how do you just go back to normal after something like this? The worst part was that I had no idea who he was, no idea why he had chosen my house. Was this the first time he had done this? Or had he been watching me before? Maybe he had seen me coming home late from work, alone, night after night, and decided I was an easy target. The thought made me feel sick. I had cameras, locks, a phone to call the police, and yet I felt completely defenseless because he didn't want to break in. He wanted me to know that he had been there, that he could have done something if he wanted to. In the days that followed, I tried to live my life normally, but nothing felt the same. Every noise outside made me jump. I started arriving home from work looking in every direction before getting out of my car, locking the front door the second I stepped inside. But the worst part was trying to sleep. Every night I stared at the camera monitor until my eyes burned. I needed to see. I needed to be sure he wasn't there. Some nights I thought I saw a shadow on the street, but when I looked again there was nothing. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe he was really gone, but how could I know? Then, a week later, as I was leaving for work, I noticed something that made me freeze in place. On the fence in my yard, barely noticeable, there was something caught between the wooden slats. A red ribbon, loosely tied in a knot. That hadn't been there before. I stepped closer, unsure if I should touch it or not. It was just a ribbon, small, insignificant, but the color, the way it had been left there, made me feel like it was a message, a reminder that I was still being watched, that he was still around. I stepped away from the fence as if the ribbon were something toxic. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I took out my phone and snapped a photo, not even knowing why. Maybe it was evidence. Maybe it was just to convince myself that it was real. I spent the rest of the day with that image burned into my mind, trying to understand what it meant. Was he trying to scare me? To make sure I knew he could come back whenever he wanted? Or, worse, was this just a game to him? That night, before bed, I locked every door and window again. But deep down, I knew locks weren't enough. He didn't need to get inside. He was already in my head. Every shadow seemed to take his shape. Every sound in the night sounded like footsteps on the gravel. I didn't know if he would return. But one thing was certain. I would never see my home as a safe place again. Story 2. At the time, I was in my final year of college, and my routine was a mess. Internship in the morning, classes in the afternoon, and late-night study sessions at friends' houses. I lived alone in a small apartment near campus, and since I didn't drive, I relied on public transportation or ride-hailing apps to get around. I had never had any serious issues with this, aside from the occasional inconvenient driver. But that night, something was different. Something that, to this day, makes me rethink every ride I take. It was almost 2 a.m. when I requested the ride. I had spent the night studying at a friend's house and was exhausted. I just wanted to get home, take a shower, and collapse into bed. The driver accepted the ride quickly, and within minutes, he was already parked in front of her building. The car seemed normal, just a dark sedan, and so did the driver, at least at first glance. A man in his early 40s, short hair, sunken eyes, wearing a worn-out hoodie. He smiled as I got into the car, but there was something strange about that smile. something that made me want to get out of there immediately. I tried to ignore my discomfort. Maybe it was just exhaustion making me paranoid. I muttered a quiet "good evening," fastened my seatbelt, and opened my phone to avoid conversation. But he didn't seem inclined to respect that. As soon as he started driving, he struck up a conversation. At first, the questions were normal. Do you study nearby? Do you work too? But as the ride went on, the questions began to change tone. Do you always take rides this late? Do you live alone or with someone? My throat went dry. He never took his eyes off the road, but his tone was strange. Too casual, like he was trying to mask an interest that was far more intense than it should be. I tried to be polite, answering in short sentences and avoiding eye contact, hoping he'd pick up on my discomfort. But he kept going. With every answer I gave, he wanted to know more. When we were just a few blocks from my building, he said something that sent a chill down my spine. You know, this neighborhood is really quiet at night. Seems like the kind of place where no one would hear if something happened. My stomach twisted. There was no reason for him to say that. None. My hands clenched into fists in my lap. Why would he say something like that? My instincts screamed at me to get out of the car as soon as possible. I pretended not to hear the comment, staring at the app's map as if checking the route. My building was only a few meters away. The moment the car stopped, I unlocked the door in one quick motion and nearly ran out, barely bothering to thank him. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own footsteps on the stairs. I got inside my apartment and locked the door behind me, turning the key twice. Only then did I exhale the breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. For a moment I thought it was over, but something made me take a step back, still gripping the key in the lock. A strange sensation, like something was still off. Slowly I approached the peephole in the door. The hallway outside was empty. I sighed in relief and was about to turn away when, at the last second, I caught a movement down below, at the building's entrance. My stomach dropped. It was him, the driver, standing in the middle of the sidewalk looking directly at my door. My body froze. He didn't move, didn't glance around. He was just there, standing still, staring at my door. The silence in the hallway felt heavier now, as if time had stopped. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the doorknob as if that could stop anything. I wanted to believe he was there by chance, maybe waiting for another ride, maybe checking his phone. But he wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't doing anything except staring at where I was. Minutes passed and he was still there. Sometimes he paced back and forth as if impatient, but he never took his eyes off my door. My chest rose and fell too fast, fear growing with every second. I grabbed my phone and opened the ride-hailing app to report his behavior, but that was when I noticed something that sent a freezing chill through my stomach. The app still showed the ride as in progress. The driver had never ended the trip. As far as the system was concerned, I was still inside that car. My fingers trembled as I stared at the phone screen. What did that mean? Was he trying to buy time? Or in his mind, did I still belong to that car? I swallowed hard and, with as much composure as I could muster, opened the app's chat and sent a message to support. I typed quickly. My driver never ended the ride and is standing outside my building. Is this normal? While waiting for a response, I took a risk and looked through the peephole again. He was still there. Now, with his hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted to the side, as if waiting for something. Time dragged on unbearably. Finally, the app responded. If your ride is still active for safety reasons, we recommend that you contact the driver and ask him to end it. My heart pounded. They wanted me to call him, to talk to that man standing outside, watching me. Before I could decide what to do, my phone vibrated again. Another message from support. But this time, my blood ran cold as I read the words on the screen. Our system shows that the driver is still en route to the destination. According to the GPS, your car is still in motion. My heart almost stopped. What do you mean the car was still moving? I was locked inside my apartment, watching with my own eyes as the driver stood outside my building. So how could the GPS be showing something else? My head spun, trying to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. I looked through the peephole again. He was still there, motionless, my stomach twisted. Did he know? Was he doing this on purpose? A way to mess with the system? To make it look like I had never arrived home? My hands were so sweaty I almost dropped my phone. Without thinking, I tapped the button to manually end the ride, but the app gave me an error. I tried again. Another error. It was as if I had no permission to leave that ride. My chest tightened. I needed to call the police. I grabbed my phone, but before I could dial, I saw a movement beneath the door. The wooden floor of the hallway reflected the faint light from outside, and for a second, I saw something that made me freeze completely. The shadow of a foot. He was coming up the stairs. My body stiffened. What was he doing? He couldn't get in. Right? The building's doors only opened with a code or a key, and I hadn't heard the front door open. So how was he there? I stepped away from the entrance, gripping my phone tightly, my breath short and unsteady. The shadow moved slowly, and then I heard it, the creak of the floor just outside my door. He was there, standing right in front of my apartment. I tried to dial the police as quickly as possible, but my fingers were shaking so badly I almost pressed the wrong number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Outside, absolute silence. No movement, no words. Just the crushing certainty that someone was standing inches away from me, separated only by a thin wooden door. When the dispatcher finally answered, I whispered my address as quietly as I could and explained the situation. They said they would send a unit immediately, but I knew he wouldn't just stand there waiting for them to arrive. I held the phone against my chest, trying to control my breathing. The silence in the hallway was unbearable. Then suddenly, a soft, dry sound that made my skin crawl. The doorknob turning. My knees almost buckled. He was trying to open the door, slowly, as if testing whether it was locked. My hands instinctively went to the lock, as if I could reinforce it with my own body. The metal creaked but didn't move. Thank God I had remembered to lock it. But what if he had a key? What if he got into the building because someone held the door open for him? I wanted to scream, but fear had stolen my voice. Then out of nowhere, the doorknob stopped moving. No sound, no movement. I stood there waiting to hear footsteps retreating, but nothing happened. I cautiously looked through the peephole, holding my breath. And that was the moment I saw something that made my throat tighten with pure terror. He was no longer facing the door. He was pressed against it, so close that all I could see through the peephole was a portion of his dark shirt. He knew I was looking. He wanted me to know. I pulled away from the peephole instinctively, as if he could see me too. My chest rose and fell at a frantic pace, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he listening to my breathing? My footsteps on the floor? Did he know exactly where I was inside the apartment? My eyes fell on the knife I always kept in the kitchen, but panic made me hesitate. What good would it do? If he got in, I wouldn't stand a chance. That was when I heard a noise outside. Footsteps. This time they weren't his. They were heavy, firm. Someone was coming up the stairs. My heart leapt. The police? A neighbor? I held my breath as the footsteps neared the door. Then without warning, the man outside moved. He didn't run, didn't make a sound. He just disappeared. I looked through the peephole in the same second and the hallway was empty. Nothing, as if he had never been there. But I knew he had. I knew he wanted me to feel every second of his presence. I stood there, paralyzed, waiting for some sign that it was over. The front door of the building opened and closed with a dull thud. I ran to the living room window and looked down at the street. There he was, walking slowly down the sidewalk, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just tried to enter my apartment. He didn't look back, didn't show any urgency. He just kept walking until he disappeared around the corner. Minutes later, the police car finally arrived. I explained everything, showed them the ride history in the app, described the man, but the response was the same as always. Without a crime being committed, there's not much we can do beyond filing a report. They asked if I wanted an escort to another location, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. He already knew where I lived. He had already chosen me. After the officers left, I finally opened the app to report him formally. But when I went to the ride history tab, a chill ran down my spine. His name was no longer there. The ride history simply didn't exist. My stomach dropped. What do you mean it didn't exist? I had just gone through all of that. The ride was active minutes ago, and now there was no record of it? I scrolled up and down, searched my email for a receipt, A notification? Nothing. It was as if that trip had never happened, as if that man had never picked me up that night. My fingers trembled as I tried to remember if I had taken a screenshot before everything disappeared, but my mind was a mess. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, clutching my phone as if it were a weapon. Every noise in the building made me jump. Every shadow in the parking lot outside seemed to be hiding him, but he never came back. At least, not that I saw. The next day, I contacted the app's support again, trying to understand what had happened. The response was cold and direct. "We have no record of any ride at that time on your account. Are you sure you used our service?" My fingers went numb holding the phone. "Are you sure you used our service?" The question echoed in my head. Yes, I was sure. I remembered every second of that ride. But if there was no record, who was he? How did he pick me up without the trip appearing in the system? I tried to retrace my steps mentally. Did I get into the wrong car? But the app showed the ride as active while I was inside it. That meant that somehow he had bypassed the system. I spent the following days living with a constant weight on my chest. I couldn't sleep properly, avoided taking rides at night, and every time I went out I looked around expecting to see him again. But he never showed up. Maybe he moved to another city. Maybe he found someone else. Maybe he's still out there, driving through silent streets waiting to find someone who doesn't realize quickly enough that something is wrong. All I know is that, to this day, every time I get into a ride-hailing car, I ask myself, what if this time the ride never gets recorded either? Story 3. I have always lived alone and never had any problems with it. My apartment was small but comfortable, located in an old building in the city center, the kind of place that creaks at night, where the neighbors talk loud enough for you to know their entire lives without ever having exchanged a word. So, when I started hearing strange noises coming from the ventilation ducts, I thought it was just another quirk of the building. Maybe rats, maybe a broken air system. But over time, the sounds became more distinct, more human. The first sign that something was wrong came on an ordinary morning. My alarm went off, and when I went to the bathroom, the cabinet door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it the night before. Small details started to bother me after that. The sugar jar out of place, the toothpaste cap left loose, the fridge that, on some mornings, seemed to have been opened during the night. I thought I was just being forgetful, maybe exhausted from work. But then, one of those nights I woke up suddenly, a chill running down my spine. I didn't know why until I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the ceiling. Something dragging through the ventilation system. This time, it wasn't a vague noise, something my mind could dismiss as pipes or wind. It was a real sound. Someone was moving up there. My body froze. I lay still in bed, holding my breath, trying to listen more carefully. A subtle scratching, a slight metallic pressure, and then a sound that made my blood run cold. The ventilation cover shifting. Slowly. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the ceiling. The vent grate was slightly displaced, and for a second I swear I saw something inside. A small, round glint. Eyes. I jumped out of bed, my entire body shaking. What was I supposed to do? Stand there and wait? Run. Fear made the decision for me. I bolted out of the bedroom, nearly stumbling, grabbed my keys and flung the apartment door open in one swift motion. I ran down the hallway without looking back, without caring what the neighbors might think of seeing me like that, barefoot, in my pajamas. When I reached the ground floor, I called the police with trembling hands. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. But when the officers arrived and went to investigate the building's attic, they found something that confirmed my worst fear. Inside the ventilation duct, right above my apartment, they found an old sleeping bag, some food wrappers, and empty bottles. Someone had been living there, above me, for days, maybe weeks, watching my every move without me knowing. The police said the space was tight, but a person could squeeze in and crawl through the ventilation system. That explained the misplaced objects, the slightly open fridge, the disturbed bathroom cabinet. I wasn't forgetting things. I wasn't being careless. Someone had been there, coming out of the duct while I slept. The worst part? They never found anyone. They searched the building, checked the attic entrances, but whoever had been there simply vanished. I moved out the next day. Since then, I've never been able to sleep in a place without looking at the corners of the ceiling, without checking every ventilation duct before turning off the lights. Because now I know, you're not always alone when you think you are.